I used to live in Ottawa lived here for about a year back in the late 70s. Haven't been back since, but I'm especially delighted to be here as part of the tree reading series, which I understand has been running since 1980, so 35 years. That's just want to acknowledge and appreciate what a stunning achievement that is, and how many people's time, energy, talents, and skills it must have taken to pull that off. When Margaret first asked me to read here last summer in Toronto, after the League of Canadian Poets Awards dinner, and I said, well, sure, but do you know where I live? She said, oh, well, I'll work on it. She obviously did, and with great success, because here I am. So I'm going to read from my book. The first poem Margaret alluded to. And the book really revolves around my father and his tortured relationship to the Holocaust, in which his entire family died. And he never really fit the classical definition of a survivor. He was in Canada. His family was in Poland, but he was here. I finally realized he could best be described as a second-hand survivor. So I'm going to read a short poem that it's like a seed poem that contains almost the entire book within its 4 lines. Second-hand survivor. My father fell victim to second-hand smoke decades before his condition had a name. His distance from those chimneys didn't spare him. His distance from those smokestacks was his disease. This poem is called Multiple Choice, and it takes that form. After everyone my father, A, loved, B, left behind, was A, gassed at 1, Belzec, 2, Helmno, 3, Sobibor, 4, Treblinka, 5, Auschwitz, or B, shot, 1, in their beds, 2, in the street, 3, at worship, 4, in a hiding place, betrayed by 1, a Polish peasant, 2, another Jew, 3, blind bad luck, or C, died of typhoid in one of A above, or D, died of starvation in 1, the Lodz ghetto, 2, the Vilna ghetto, 3, the Lublin ghetto, 4, the Warsaw ghetto, or C, died in the boxcar on the way to one of A above, or none of the above. He never said a word about them. He carried them all to his grave as if believing that closing his fists on their lives without letting a drop, A, spill out, or B, ooze between his fingers was C, the only way to keep them alive. This poem is called Shut Up, Please, I'm Not Talking. After the disaster, only money talked. The dead stubbed out their tongues and kept on walking. Who knew how to bury puffs of smoke? In his silence, my father became a wordless poet. Every end-stopped breath, a rhyme for death. It always walked behind us. Its penumbra always fell 2 steps ahead. It wasn't grunts. It wasn't gnashing or savage music. It wasn't a wordless wailing for the dead. It wasn't the language even the dead can't stop rehearsing, their long, repetitive solos, drums, and the clarinet's wail. It wasn't the stutter of pebbles rattling in his throat. It was the only way he could say what couldn't be said. Some families bury stones when they have no bodies. He buried every word they ever spoke. Thank you. This poem refers to the International Tracing Service in Bad Arolsen in Germany, which serves victims of Nazi persecution and their families by documenting their faith, their faith through the archives that it manages. It's called Traces. 51 million documents name the victims. 700 orphans dial their number every day. And wait for someone to retrieve a scrap of paper, and wait for a voice at the end of the line to tell them how and when and where their relatives died. down to how many lice, they kept good records, crawled on any given prisoner's head. Their number is etched in my speed dial, a shrine to the idol of closure. I call it a dozen times a day. On hold, I listen to a cantor chant prayers for the dead. When I confess I can't spell their last names in Polish, they assure me they've developed algorithms to correct for any gaps. When I ask, a gap so big it swallowed Poland? How many shovels does it take to correct for that? They warn me not to get smart. When I tell them the chain of custody was corrupted by my birth, they start to lose patience, but add they might be able to help if I gave them at least one name. As if he ever spoke their names out loud. Unless the furry syllables of his snores were some kind of code. He napped every night after dinner. Memories mulched under the headlines, folded over his face. When they put me on hold again, a sales pitch loops through the system. Group excursions to Eastern Europe, annotated tours of memories' ruins, very popular with your second generation. I correct the anonymous voice. I'm the last generation. No digging through Polish potato fields for me. I'm explaining myself long after the line's gone dead. Lead an excursion to Poland before I was born, so I can bring them back alive. Oh, you can name your own price. Take me back to when the rest of me still lived, before my father's amputations and my mother's missing milk. Back before Hitler, that goes without saying. Before Wagner and Bismarck and Luther. Germany, just to be sure. Before the bloody battalions of holy hermits and saints, the cleanup squads of the Crusaders, before the expulsion from Spain, before Aquinas, Augustine, and Paul marching down the centuries through our shtetls, shovels, mops, and Bibles shoulder high, before the Gospels, before God's wanton promise, seed as numberless as the flakes of ash, crowning Poland's sky. Thank you. In this poem, the term Musulmaner comes up in a few other poems. It was a term coined to describe those concentration camp inmates who just gave up, surrendered to their fate, the barely living dead. It's called Anne in the Attic. In the camps, the Musulmaner gave up first. You couldn't say they were living, you couldn't say they were dead. They were like the mannequins who modeled clothes in my father's store. One lived in our attic. We called her Anne. She even looked a little Dutch, with her blonde wig and wooden clogs. Not that she ever wore them. She couldn't risk the noise. The real Anne could have used a wig like hers. She's been there ever since I turned 13, the day my father brought her home from his store. It's time, he said, you learn to live like a Jew. Forget the rabbi's nonsense. She'll teach you everything you need to know. Up the stairs to the tiny attic, he locked us in. In the camps, all the Musulmaner cared about was food. If you grabbed one by the throat, it might collapse. They lived, if you call that living, from finger to mouth. They ran out of time before they could learn the rules. Before he turned the key, he gave me a sandwich. From your mother, he sighed, as if I couldn't guess. She worries you might get hungry. Better, she worries you won't learn how to starve. Earliest rivals. I used to think my earliest rival was my parents' best friend's son, but now I suspect his parents. It was after the war, and my father was busy shopping for replacements. For reasons never explained to me, I didn't fit the bill. They'd survived the camps. Who could compete with that? Not my father. Who knew what to call his stunned condition? Any pain he could claim paled next to theirs. 3 mannequins preened in his storefront window, more than he could afford for a struggling store. He'd printed numbers on their wrists in indelible ink. On his own, the scars were barely healed. When he took my hand, I could feel their fevered ridge. The mannequins' hands were cool and smooth. Musulmaner, they'd given up on life. My rivals wore their shirt sleeves long, their voices buttoned, buried their memories in a place they'd never find. My father had none of his own, so he couldn't sleep. He prowled the small town streets until first light, asking the stop signs how and where and when his brothers died. He needed to rub himself raw against the crime. They'd been there. They could tell him what it was like. They tried. The problem was they had survived. They could tell him what it was like, up to a point. The point where the capo shoved the naked bodies through the doors, and an unseen hand poured in the Zyklon B. The point where his naked brothers always disappeared from my father's sight. I had no need to worry about my rivals. They were as useless in the end as his only son. This poem refers obliquely to a brisk trade that went on in the 1940s between the death camps and in Eastern Europe and German felt and textile manufacturers. It's called My Grandmother's Hair. If you travel to Germany, tell me if you slept on my grandmother's hair. You'd know. In the night, you would have heard the mattress rustle and the sigh buried deep in its stuffing. My grandmother dreaming of me. Another poem where food plays a central role, called Whittled and Fed. My mother wanted boatloads of children. My father wanted to curl up and die. Who knew from therapy it was 1945? And even if they did, who had the money? You worked things out the best you could. You gave a little here, you took a little there. She agreed to stop at me, he agreed to live. This worked, until it didn't. She wanted more, he wanted less, and I kept getting bigger. Every plate she placed in front of me made it worse. My mother believed in addition. If one was all she got, she'd cook for 10. My father in subtraction. The less you were, the easier to hide. One built me up, the other whittled away. This next poem has another existence. My wife is a ceramic sculptor, and the gallery that she was in a few years ago, the gallery owner on Salt Spring invited the artists and their partners to collaborate on pieces. So this was, I had the easy part. I just gave her a poem I'd already written. She did a painting and ceramic faces, heads that she attached to it, and this poem ran in between them. It's called Postcards from Poland, Prayers. My father pasted them on the walls of our cramped apartment in neat chronological rows. Invasion, occupation, ghetto. Then the first hesitant rumors of the camps. Postcards from Poland, every other word, rescue or help. I lay in my crib while he paced their circuit, condemning himself and the voices of his dead. All he had left of them, lines of faded ink, not even enough to knot into a noose. At night the postcards whispered to themselves. Words were not what I heard, but the rustle of bodies, rising from crushed consonants and vowels. They were 9. I made a minion. They were willing to overlook my tender age. Now they could pray for my father to let them go. They didn't know that the air in my father's house was clotted with unanswered prayers. How could their pleas rise to the ceiling, let alone soar through the roof? In my father's house, were prayers answered, they would be alive instead of him. Big tomatoes. My father refuses food from anyone's garden. He knows how they grow those big tomatoes. You dig a dead Jew in your soil. That's how they did it in Poland the year the postcard stopped, that year of the bumper crops, that year they fertilized their fields with bone and ash. Better the cans of soup that line the cellar. Sometimes My mother can't help it. She stomps a few seeds under her heel and prays for rain. If he catches her, he calls her a capo. If she stoops to pull a weed, he pulls his hair. He remembers what happened the last time they weeded Europe. The disciplined ranks of tomatoes, the cabbages in their rigid, orderly rows, the peasants with their sharpened hoes and sickles. Smoke from the trampled heaps of weeds in the ditches still stings his eyes. He refuses to let one tear water the ground. A number of these poems have this figure that I refer to as my clubfoot twin. He comes up as he's kind of a liminal dream figure, and he plays a role in this poem called Station, Scarecrow, Twin. 2 parts. 1. I find myself at the end of the line, waiting to board a train with my clubfoot twin. The engines are snowing, and the moonlight is broken in two by their hesitant hum. The station looks almost abandoned. Weeds climb up the wall. It's the first time we've met, and he hands me his suitcase, a blood-red leather valise, and a portrait in a pewter frame, 2 children, the daughter who drowned and the son the fire claimed, both of us at the end of our father's line. We ask for 2 tickets to Poland on the train that goes back in time. The conductor says, "Come back tomorrow. Can't we see night closing in?" Behind us, the tracks shine with a second skin of bone-white ice. In a perfect world, he would never have left my side. 2. He buries our father's pitchfork in a mound of smoldering hay. Feed for the horses who haul this winter's dead, our garden's perennial crop. Mice nibble the feet of the scarecrow he stuffed with last year's straw. 4 crows, unruffled, peck at its coal-black eyes, twin lumps that mirror mine. I remember the hospital hallways. I remember asking the doctors where he had gone. They said his illness had no cure this side of Poland. They sent him there to be nursed by my father's lost tribe. He drags his foot and scribbles riddles in the snow. 2 golden-haired boys, 1 pitchfork between them. How many times do they stab the haystack before they find a Jew? A different 2 boys, 1 bucket between them, hair black as coal. How much mud do they have to haul to bury the dead floating belly up in their father's eyes? And I'll close with the last poem from the book. And it was... Here we go. It was inspired by an incident recounted by the Argentinian writer Jacobo Timmerman. After the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile, 26 men from the village of Calama were taken and shot for no reason anyone ever discovered. Eventually, the story came to the attention of psychiatrists, and they concluded the first phase of treating the families with a ceremony in a cemetery. All the women gathered there with their children, friends, neighbors, psychologists, and photographs of their murdered sons and husbands whom they symbolically buried. The villagers told stories to one another, shared food, and sang familiar songs and hymns. At the ceremony in Calama, death ceased to be an end and became a beginning. But that was Chile, and this is Poland. It's called Father, Your Village. 1. My father is a stone in a field of women. It rains all day, but they do not share their water. My father is a stone in a field of women. The moon is full, but they make his bed in shadow. My father is a stone in a field of women. The wind moans, but they won't repeat its stories. 2. Father, your village in Poland gone, who will mourn with you now? Family, neighbors, enemies gone, who will mourn with you now? Cheder, shops and synagogues gone, who will mourn with you now? Every last Jew in Poland gone, who will mourn with you now? Who is your village now? A field of stones, rub them together. these stones will curdle milk? Who will teach them to sing and give them tongues? A field of stones is my village. Stuff them in my pockets. Let them drag me to the bottom of Poland's swamp. Who will paint these stones with faces that look like yours? With eyes that look on the living as well as the dead. A field of stones is my village. Heavier than extinction, we pass them from hand to hand. Who will roll away the stone that seals the tunnel your dead dig home to Poland every night? Who will roll away the stone at the mouth of your mouth? My village is a field of stones at the end of the line. Plant them, the dead will root again in Poland's mud. Father, your eyes that snow in Poland cannot hold your dead. They spill out every night. They crowd my crib. Their voices coat my tongue with flakes of ash. Take up your shovel. Dig them a place of rest. Even their eyelids and fingernails gone, how can I bury my dead? Even their hair and ashes gone, how can I bury my dead? Every stone of their village gone, how can I bury my dead? 3. If they live in me. Thank you.